There is a kind of grief that does not announce itself with tears. It arrives quietly, the way cold air slips under a door. You don't notice it until you are already shivering. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in March, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers, and I held her hand until it went still. I was 31 years old. I was a licensed practical nurse. I had driven 40 minutes in the dark every morning for the last 3 weeks to be at her bedside before my shift started. And I had driven 40 minutes back every night telling myself she would still be there tomorrow. She was, until she wasn't. And I thought, standing in that hallway after the doctor said the words, that the worst of it was already behind me. I was wrong about that. The worst of it was waiting for me in the parking lot of a church fellowship hall 4 days later, wearing dress shoes and a borrowed tie, and handing my mother's car keys to a woman who had never once visited her in the hospital. My name is Rachel Elaine Marsh. I am 31 years old. I work as a licensed practical nurse at a mid-sized regional hospital in Dayton, Ohio, and I have worked there for 6 years. I am not wealthy. I am not dramatic. I am the kind of person who keeps receipts, reads the fine print, and shows up early. I am also the kind of person who loved her mother more than she knew how to say out loud, and who spent most of her adult life trying to hold a fractured family together with both hands while everyone else walked away from the pieces. This is the story of the day I finally let go, and it is the story of what happened when I did. My mother's name was Diane. She was 58 years old when she died, which is not old enough by any measure. She had warm brown eyes and a laugh that started in her chest before it ever reached her face. And she made the best sweet potato pie in Montgomery County without a single argument from anyone who had ever tasted it. She also had, for the last 14 years of her life, a husband named Gerald Hutchins, who was not my father, who had never tried to be my father, and who had spent the better part of a decade making it quietly, consistently clear that his primary loyalty was to his biological daughter, Vanessa, and that my presence in the family home was something he tolerated the way you tolerate a draft, with mild inconvenience and the occasional complaint. My real father left when I was 7. I don't carry bitterness about that anymore. What I carry is the memory of watching my mother rebuild herself from nothing, working double shifts at a dry cleaning business learning to fix her own plumbing, raising me in a small rented house in Huber Heights until she finally had enough saved to buy something of her own. She bought a pale yellow house on a corner lot in Kettering when I was 19, the year I started nursing school, and she cried when she signed the papers. Not big sobs, just a single tear she wiped with the back of her hand before anyone could see it. I saw it. I always saw it. She met Gerald at her church. He was a deacon, which in my mother's world carried weight. He was polished and soft-spoken and attentive in the way that certain men are attentive when they are trying to win something. He had a daughter, Vanessa, who was 23 at the time and lived in Columbus and came to family dinners approximately twice a year, bearing expensive wine she'd gotten on sale and opinions she'd formed that morning. My mother loved Gerald. I want to be fair about that. She was happy with him in ways that I could see from the outside, even when I disagreed with his choices. She deserved to be happy. I never once tried to take that from her. What I could not protect her from was Gerald's particular talent for quiet financial erosion. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most damage happens in a family. Slowly, incrementally, always with a reasonable explanation. The vacation they took to Myrtle Beach that my mother paid for because Gerald's account had a timing issue. The roof repair in 2019 that my mother funded from her savings because Gerald had a contractor contact who needed payment up front. The monthly household expenses that my mother covered in full for the last 3 years of her life because Gerald had some business challenges he was working through. I know these numbers because my mother told me, not in complaint. In the quiet, matter-of-fact way she told me most things, as though reciting facts from a ledger she'd made peace with. What she never told Gerald What she never told anyone except me and her attorney was that in the summer of 2022, 8 months before she died, she had her car transferred into my name. The car was a 2019 Hyundai Sonata in pearl white. She bought it new, paid it off in 3 years, and maintained it meticulously. She took it for oil changes every 4,000 miles without fail. She kept the owner's manual in the glove box with all the service records tucked neatly inside. That car was one of the few things she owned outright, free and clear, with no shared account, no joint financing, no Gerald. And one afternoon in July, she sat across from me at her kitchen table while Gerald was at a deacon's meeting, and she told me she wanted to put it in my name. She said she had reasons she didn't fully explain. She said she'd been thinking about it for a while. She said she trusted me to do right by it. We went to the BMV that same week. The title was transferred. I paid the small fee. She kept driving the car. Nothing about her daily life changed, but the legal ownership had shifted quietly and completely into my hands. I kept the title in a fireproof box in my apartment closet. I did not think about it much after that. It felt like something my mother had done for her own peace of mind, and I respected that without needing to understand it fully. She was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer in October of that year. She was gone by March. I want to tell you about the repast because I want you to understand how ordinary the beginning of it felt. Repasts in Black church communities are their own particular kind of event. They are catered grief. They are love expressed through aluminum trays of baked macaroni and carved ham and green beans cooked with smoked turkey. And they smell like every grandmother's kitchen compressed into one room. The fellowship hall at my mother's church was full by noon. People I hadn't seen in years were there. Cousins, church mothers, old co-workers, neighbors from the Huber Heights house. There was noise and warmth and the low, constant hum of people saying her name and meaning it. I was standing near the food table, holding a plate I wasn't eating from, accepting hugs from people whose faces I was struggling to place, when I noticed Vanessa come through the side door. She was dressed well, a black wrap dress, heeled boots, her hair blown out. She looked like she was attending a networking event that happened to have a funeral program on the table. She hugged Gerald for a long time. She did not come to speak to me. I watched them from across the room, not with hostility, just with the quiet observation I had learned to apply to situations I didn't fully trust. I had been watching Gerald and Vanessa interact for over a decade, and I had developed a kind of fluency in what their body language meant. The way he leaned toward her and spoke with his hand on her shoulder, that was Gerald in operational mode, not grief mode. That was Gerald making arrangements. I did not know yet what arrangements he was making. It was Gerald's cousin, a woman named Brenda, who had never particularly liked me, but also had never mastered the art of minding her business, who told me. She appeared at my elbow sometime around 2 in the afternoon while I was clearing plates, and she said, with the casual delivery of someone reporting weather, that Gerald had just given Vanessa the keys to Diane's car, said Vanessa needed a reliable vehicle, and that Diane would have wanted someone to have it, rather than it just sitting. I set the plates down slowly. I asked Brenda to repeat herself. She did, with slightly more detail. Gerald had made the announcement quietly, just to immediate family standing near the exit, meaning Vanessa, Brenda, and 2 of Gerald's brothers. He had taken the keys from his jacket pocket. He had pressed them into Vanessa's hand. Vanessa had said, according to Brenda, "I'll take good care of it," and then walked out to the parking lot to look at it. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not feel rage. I felt something colder and more clarifying than rage. I felt the particular stillness that comes when something you half expected finally arrives and is worse than you anticipated. I had always known Gerald would try to absorb my mother's assets into his world. I had not known he would do it in the fellowship hall of her church, 4 hours after we buried her, with her food still warm on the table. I excused myself from the conversation with Brenda. I walked to the restroom. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, the way I do when I need to slow my nervous system down, a trick I learned in nursing school and have used more than I expected. I looked at myself in the mirror. I said nothing out loud. I thought one thing clearly, he doesn't know about the title. And then I dried my hands, walked back into the fellowship hall, and finished the repast like a woman who had no idea anything had happened. Before I tell you what I did next, I need to ask you something, because I genuinely want to know. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I'm always curious how far a story like this travels, how many kitchens and living rooms and parked cars it reaches, because the women who need to hear this story most are usually watching from somewhere they think no one can see them. So if that's you, stay with me. Gerald came to speak to me before I left the repast. He was gracious about it in the way he was gracious about everything. Warm surface, strategic core. He told me my mother had loved me very much. He told me the house would need to be sorted out in the coming weeks, and he hoped we could handle it calmly. He did not mention the car. He looked me in the eyes the entire time and did not mention the car once. Either he had forgotten that my mother and I had any kind of close relationship, or he had decided I simply wouldn't know what he'd done until it was too late to matter. I smiled. I said I appreciated him saying so. I said I was sure we'd figure everything out. Vanessa drove my mother's car out of that parking lot at 3001 teen in the afternoon. I watched from the fellowship hall window, pearl white. Clean tires, the service record still in the glove box. I memorized the moment the way you memorize a number you'll need later. I drove home in my own car. I made tea. I opened my closet and took the fireproof box off the shelf and opened it on my kitchen counter. The title was exactly where I had put it. Rachel Elaine Marsh, listed as owner. The car's VIN number printed in clean black type. My mother's signature on the transfer documents dated July 14, 2022. Her handwriting, neat, slightly slanted, unmistakable. I sat with that document for a long time, not because I needed to verify it, I knew what it said. I sat with it because I was sitting with her. Because her hand had touched this paper. Because she had known in some way I was only beginning to understand that this moment would come, and she had prepared for it as quietly and practically as she had done everything else in her life. I put the title back in the box. I closed the lid. I called my friend Tamara, who is a paralegal and who has been my emergency contact in both medical and legal senses for the past 4 years, and I told her everything that had happened. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "So he handed someone else's car to his daughter?" I said yes. She said, "And you have the title?" I said yes. She said, "Rachel, honey, he has no idea what he just did." And I said, "I know." That night, I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. The morning after the repast, I woke at 5:15, which is my normal time on workdays. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad. I am a legal pad person, always have been, and I wrote out everything I knew in clean, numbered lines. 1. I held legal title to the vehicle. 2. Gerald had given the vehicle to Vanessa without legal authority to do so. 3. Vanessa was currently in possession of a vehicle she had no legal claim to. 4. I had not confronted anyone, made any accusations, or shown any awareness that anything unusual had occurred. 5. I had approximately 4 days before Vanessa would return to Columbus with the car, at which point recovering it would involve additional jurisdictional complexity. I numbered 5 items and then I circled number 5 twice. I did not call Gerald. I did not call Vanessa. I did not call any of the relatives who had been at the repast. What I did was call the non-emergency line for the Dayton Police Department and ask a general question about the process for reporting a vehicle in the possession of someone who is not the registered owner. The officer I spoke with was helpful. He explained that if I had the title showing my ownership and the vehicle had been taken without my consent, I could file a report. He used the words unauthorized. I wrote that word on my legal pad and underlined it. Then I called Tamara again, and she walked me through the civil side, what my options were if I wanted to handle it quietly through proper channels versus what escalation would look like. She said the cleanest path was a police report plus a certified letter to both Gerald and Vanessa stating that I held title and was requesting voluntary return of the vehicle within a specified number of days before further action was taken. She said further action was a beautiful phrase because it implied everything and committed to nothing. I agree. I want to pause here and tell you something about what it felt like to do these things, because I think people misunderstand what calm looks like from the inside. Calm is not the absence of feeling. I was devastated. I was grieving. There was a version of me that wanted to drive to Gerald's house and stand on the lawn and say things I had been keeping back for 14 years. But I am a nurse. I work in environments where the cost of losing emotional regulation is measured in patient outcomes. I have spent 6 years learning to be the steadiest person in a room when everything is falling apart. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that losing my composure now would give Gerald exactly what he needed to paint me as unstable, as difficult, as the problem child Diane had always struggled with. He would use my grief against me, so I gave him nothing to use. I took the day off work. I drove to the BMV office on Needmore Road and asked to verify the current registered owner of the vehicle by VIN number. They confirmed it. Rachel Elaine Marsh. I asked for a printed confirmation. They provided it. I paid the small administrative fee, folded the paper, put it in my purse, and thanked the woman at the counter. From the BMV, I drove to a UPS store and sent 2 certified letters. One to Gerald's address, my mother's house, which was now Gerald's house, which was a whole other conversation happening in parallel with the state attorneys. One to Vanessa's address in Columbus, which I had from a Christmas card my mother had sent 2 years prior, and which I had kept in my address book because I keep everything. Both letters stated the same thing in language Tamara had helped me draft, that I was the legal owner of the 2019 Hyundai Sonata VIN number included, and that I was formally requesting the vehicle be returned to me within 72 hours of receipt of this letter, and that failure to comply would result in a police report being filed for unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. I signed both letters. I paid for certified tracking. I drove home. On the way, I stopped at a grocery store and bought ingredients for the sweet potato pie recipe my mother had written out for me on a note card when I was 22. I went home and made the pie. It took 2 hours. The kitchen smelled like butter and cinnamon and something I don't have a word for, but that felt like her. I cried exactly once, standing at the counter waiting for the crust to cool, and then I stopped, because there was more to do and she would have wanted me to do it. The certified letters were delivered the following morning. I know this because I tracked them on my phone while I was in the break room at the hospital between a 6 a.m. admission and a 9 a.m. medication round. Gerald's was signed for at 9,047 a.m. Vanessa's was signed for at 11,003 a.m. I noted the times on my legal pad when I got home. Gerald called me at 11,022 a.m. I did not answer. He called again at 11,031 and 11,044 and 11,058. I let them go to voicemail. At 12,015, he left a message. I want to be precise about what he said because his words matter. He said in a voice that was working hard to stay measured that he didn't understand why I was doing this, that the car had been sitting in the driveway unused while I had my own vehicle, and that my mother would not have wanted me to make things difficult during what was already a painful time. He said he hoped I would reconsider and call him back. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he had made an error. He said I was making things difficult. I wrote down the time of the voicemail and the key phrases. I saved the audio. Vanessa called at 12,034. I did not answer. She did not leave a voicemail. She sent a text instead that said, "Rachel, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. That car was my dad's to give. Please call me." I took a screenshot. I did not reply. What happened next is the part of the story I want you to sit with, because it is the part that tells you who these people actually were beneath the church suits and the fellowship hall smiles. By the end of day 2, Gerald had called me 14 times. Vanessa had called 9 times and sent 6 texts. At no point in any voicemail or text did either of them say, "We didn't know the car was yours. We made a mistake. We're sorry. Please tell us how to fix this." Every communication was a variation of the same message. You are being unreasonable. unreasonable, your mother would be disappointed. This is not how family handles things. That word, family. Gerald deployed it like a tool. Family doesn't go to the police. Family talks things out. Family considers what people have been through. He had used it for 14 years to mean, you should accept less, you should give more, you should be grateful for what I allow you to call yourself. Family, in Gerald's usage, was a mechanism for compliance, and for 14 years, out of love for my mother, I had complied. My mother was not here anymore. On the morning of day 3, I filed the police report. The officer I spoke with was a woman in her 40s named Officer Delacroix, who had the energy of someone who had heard every version of every story and was interested in facts. I showed her the title. I showed her the BMV confirmation. I showed her the certified letter tracking receipts. I showed her the voicemails and the texts. She took notes. She said the matter was clear from a legal standpoint. I held title, I had not consented to the transfer, and the vehicle was in the possession of a third party without authorization. She said she would contact Vanessa and Gerald to inform them that the vehicle needed to be returned within 24 hours, or the department would proceed accordingly. I drove back to work. I performed 4 patient assessments, assisted with 2 transfers, and ate lunch at my desk like a woman who had not just set something irreversible in motion. That afternoon, my phone received 31 calls in 4 hours. Gerald, Vanessa, a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Gerald's brother Earl, who had apparently been recruited as a negotiator. Brenda, the cousin who had told me about the keys at the repast and who was now, with stunning flexibility, taking Gerald's side. Another unfamiliar number that went to voicemail and turned out to be a pastor from my mother's church whom Gerald had called to serve as a mediator. I listened to every voicemail. I saved every one. I responded to none. The pastor's message, I want to tell you about specifically, because it was the most sophisticated of the attempts. He was kind. He spoke of community and healing and the importance of not letting grief make decisions for us. He said that my mother had been a beloved member of their congregation and that he knew she would want her family to find peace. He said he'd be happy to facilitate a conversation. He was, I want to be clear, a decent man doing what a decent man in his position would do when someone he respected had called him in distress. He was not wrong about any of the things he said as abstract principles. He was simply being used, without knowing it, as a pressure instrument. I texted him the next day, politely, and explained that I was handling a legal matter and that once it was resolved, I would be happy to speak with him. I thanked him for his care. I meant it. On day 4, Vanessa drove my mother's car back to Dayton. She did not drive it to my apartment. She drove it to Gerald's house and left it in the driveway and went inside. I know this because the officer from the Dayton PD called me to inform me the vehicle had been returned to the registered address my mother had used on the title, which was technically Gerald's address. Since she had updated it when they married and before the transfer to me had processed with the new address, this created a small administrative wrinkle that required one more trip to the BMV, which I handled the following morning with the same efficiency I'd applied to everything else. By noon on day 5, the Hyundai Sonata was parked in front of my apartment building. I had the keys. The service records were still in the glove box, and Gerald had made 47 calls in 4 days. I want to tell you about the moment Gerald finally reached me, because it did not happen the way he planned it. He showed up at my apartment on the afternoon of day 5. I want to describe this carefully because the image of it matters. He was wearing the same dark blazer he'd worn to the repast, as though he had not fully changed out of funeral mode in the days since. He looked tired in the way that people look when they have spent several days being angry and have mistaken their anger for effort. He knocked 3 times. I had seen him pull up from my window. I waited a full minute before I opened the door. He stood in my doorway and looked past me into my apartment and then back at my face, and I could see him cycling through approaches the way you can see someone shuffle through cards. He settled on measured disappointment, which had always been his most effective register with me in the past. He said, "Rachel, I think we need to talk." I said, "All right." I did not step back to let him in. I stood in the doorway. He said my mother would have been heartbroken by how I'd handled this. He said that Vanessa was upset, that she had cried, that the experience of having the police contact her had been humiliating. He said that all he had been trying to do was make sure Diane's things went to people who would appreciate them. He said the word family 4 times in the first 2 minutes. I counted. I let him finish. I waited a beat after he stopped talking, the way I do with patients who need to feel heard before they can absorb information. Then I said, Gerald, my mother transferred the title to that car into my name in July of 2022. She did it at the BMV. It's a matter of public record. That car has been legally mine for 8 months. I said it the way I'd say a diagnosis. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just plainly. He stared at me, and I want to tell you what happened to his face in that moment, because I have thought about it many times since. The disappointment fell away. The pastoral warmth fell away. What was left underneath was something simpler and less constructed. Just a man realizing that he had miscalculated that there was a fact he had not known and could not argue with, and that everything he had done in the last 4 days had been done in ignorance of that fact. He had given away something that was never his to give. He had made 47 phone calls and recruited a pastor and sent his brother and organized a pressure campaign, all of it built on an assumption that had been wrong. He said, "She never told me." I said, "No, she didn't." There was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for him and clarifying for me. I want to say something about my mother in that silence, because she was present in it. She had known Gerald well enough, loved him, and known him, to understand that certain things needed to be protected from his management. She had not told him about the title transfer because she had known, in the quiet, practical way she knew most things, that if she did, it would become a negotiation. She had simply done it. She had trusted me with it. She had, in the only way available to her, tried to make sure that at least one thing she loved would land safely. Gerald said that he thought I could have handled it differently. He said that going to the police was an escalation. He said that if I had simply called him, they could have worked it out. I said, I sent certified letters to both of you first. You received yours on a Wednesday morning. By that afternoon, you had called me 14 times and left a voicemail telling me I was making things difficult. I did not escalate. I followed the process. He opened his mouth and closed it. I said, I know you loved her. I know you're grieving. I am too. But that car was mine before she passed, and everything you did this week, including giving it away at her repast, was done without knowing that. I'm not angry at you for not knowing, but I need you to understand that I wasn't going to let it go, not because of the car, because of what it meant that you didn't think to ask. I don't know if he understood that. I don't know if the distinction between the car and what the car represented was one he was capable of making at that particular moment. He was a man who had operated for 14 years in a household where his assumptions were rarely checked, and I had just checked one in a way that could not be undone. That is a disorienting experience for people who are unaccustomed to it. He left without saying much more. He walked back to his car with the deliberate posture of a man working hard not to look diminished. I watched him go from my doorway. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and called Tamara. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, like I did something my mother couldn't do for herself. Tamara said, that's exactly what you did. What happened in the weeks that followed was quieter, but no less significant. Gerald contested certain elements of my mother's estate. There were accounts and items that were legitimately in dispute, and I engaged an estate attorney and handled all of it through proper legal channels. I won some of those disputes and accepted fair settlements on others. I did not fight for the sake of fighting. I fought for what was documentably mine and let go of what wasn't worth the cost. Vanessa sent me one more text, about 2 weeks after she had returned the car. She said she hadn't known about the title and that she was sorry if she had done something that hurt me. It was the closest thing to an apology I received from anyone. I read it twice. I wrote back and said I believed her about the title and that I hoped she was well. I meant both things. She had been used by her father as much as I had, in different ways, and I didn't carry particular anger toward her. I do not speak to Gerald, not from bitterness, bitterness. The bitterness has largely metabolized into something quieter. I don't speak to him because there is nothing left between us now that my mother is gone. And maintaining a relationship with someone who made me feel like an afterthought in my own family story is not something I'm willing to budget emotional energy toward. That is not a dramatic declaration. It is just the truth. I drive my mother's car. I had it detailed the week I got it back. I put a small thing on the rearview mirror. One of her church fans, the kind they give out at summer services with a picture of a peaceful landscape on one side. It moves a little when I accelerate. Some mornings when I'm driving to the hospital in the early dark, I can almost hear her telling me I'm doing fine, that I handled it right, that she knew I would. I want to talk to you now about something that took me longer to understand than the legal and logistical parts of this story. I spent a lot of years inside a family dynamic that taught me my value was conditional. I don't mean they said that outright. No one in these situations says it outright. What they do is demonstrate it consistently through small choices. Who gets included in decisions, whose feelings are treated as relevant, whose name comes up when things need distributing, and whose name comes up when things need doing. I was always in the second category. I was the one who showed up for hospital shifts and covered emotional labor and asked for nothing and received less than that. I used to tell myself that was just how families worked, that there was something noble about endurance, that if I just kept showing up, kept being reliable, kept being the person everyone could count on, eventually that would be recognized and returned. I want to be honest with you, that belief was not noble, it was trained. I had been conditioned to accept the terms of my inclusion as non-negotiable, to treat my own needs as the variable in an equation where everyone else's comfort was the constant. My mother leaving me that title was the most practical and the most profound thing she ever did for me. She did not leave me a speech or a letter or a dramatic bedside revelation. She left me a legal document and a trip to the BMV. She left me the specific, concrete things she knew I would need when the time came. That was her love language. Not sentiment, but preparation. Not promises, but paperwork. I have thought often about what I want to pass on from this experience. Not as advice, because I don't think my experience translates directly to anyone else's, but as something offered, a series of observations from someone who went through something and came out the other side with her car and her dignity and her mother's sweet potato pie recipe. The first is this. Documentation is a form of love. My mother did not protect me with emotion or confrontation. She protected me with a transfer document and a visit to a government office. The people who love you best are often the ones who prepare you for the moments they won't be there for. The second is this. Calm is not passivity. The week after my mother's repast, I made phone calls and drafted letters and visited offices and filed reports, and I did all of it without raising my voice once. This was not because I felt nothing. I felt enormous things. I did it because I had learned from years of nursing and from watching my mother that the world responds to composure, that there is a way to be completely serious about protecting yourself that looks, from the outside, like patience. The third is this. Family is not a blank check drawn on your soul. There is a version of family loyalty that is genuine and that I believe in. The kind built from showing up consistently, from choosing each other across years, from mutual investment in each other's well-being. And then there is another version that is not loyalty at all, that is just the word loyalty being used to demand compliance. Learning to tell the difference in my own life, in my own bones, has been the work of the last several years. My mother's death accelerated that work in ways I am still processing. I do not think Gerald is a monster. I do not think Vanessa is a monster. I think they are people who made assumptions and acted on them and didn't expect to be met with anything other than acquiescence, because for 14 years that is mostly what they had gotten. The surprise on Gerald's face when I told him about the title was not the surprise of a villain caught. It was the surprise of a person encountering, for the first time in a long time, a wall where there had always been an open door. That's not a dramatic story. That is just the ordinary experience of what happens when someone who has learned to say yes, Finally, quietly, says no. I want to say one more thing before I go, and it is the thing I have said to myself most often in the months since this happened. Usually in the morning when I am driving to work and the road is mostly empty and the church van is moving on the rearview mirror, I spent years making myself smaller to fit into a space that was not designed to hold me. I made myself quieter, more accommodating, more available. I told myself it was love. It was some of it. But some of it was also fear. Fear of being excluded, fear of being called difficult, fear of losing the last pieces of a family that was already mostly lost. And what I know now, on the other side of the hardest month of my life, is that the space I was shrinking myself to fit into was not worth the shape I was losing. My mother knew that. She prepared me for it in the only way she could. She went to the BMV on a Tuesday afternoon in July and signed a piece of paper and trusted me to know what to do with it when the time came. I knew what to do with it. I would like to think that wherever she was not surprised. So here is what I want to ask you. If you were sitting at that repast table, watching someone hand away something that was yours, smiling at you while they did it, counting on your silence, would you have stayed or walked out? Comment one word. Stayed if you would have kept the peace for the sake of family. LEF. If you would have started making calls the same night. I read every single comment, every one.
画风多少会有一些疯狂，但是一想到这些疯狂是深陷于抑郁症斗争之中显出来的，用搞怪的笔触去画一些人们无法克服的拖延，决心改变却